areas. How has racialized settlement changed? And certainly this is one major component, a geographical question about race and space. But we're also concerned with the place of race conceptually, with posing the plausibility of the post-racial in the contemporary world, and to ask how race appears after racial science of both the biological and cultural varieties. If Paul Gilroy enjoins us to think against race, to be past it, how might we conceive of the impasse where we all know that race has no basis intellectually, and yet it still exists? Is our quest once again to emphasize the arbitrariness of race, of the problem of the categories of race? Or do we have to, with following W.J.T. Mitchell, think through race, to show the racial dimensions hiding in many of the contemporary conflicts in our world? Is there a way beyond race to think through it, rather than ignoring it or denying it? So this theme, as a totality, will offer us presentations of past placements of race, analyses of attempts to break free of race and place as a couplet. We will interrogate the interstices and the limits of racial categories, as well as present research on racial identifications. Finally, we'll end with a comparison of a context where race might be structured or experienced differently. If we can just look at the schedule. These are the seminars that we have lined up until the end of April. So we're starting with Andrew today, then Dan Jan in 2 weeks' time, who will think specifically about ambivalence of issues of race and belonging to apartheid. Then our very own Rob Patman and Megan Robertson will speak about the place of race in teaching and research in Stellenbosch. Then Sophie Oldfield and Sue Parnell will speak of racial geographies after apartheid. We'll have Patricia Hayes thinking about Namibia and tax law. Then Deborah Posel and Jerry Murray about racial categories and practices. Ramesh Lalu about becoming technical. Then after the break, we have a couple of panels, one of which will interrogate Volkekunde, and another of which will think about museums. And then finally, Ashil Mbembe and Sarah Nuttall will think about the post-racial. And they've told me already they want to bring the context of Ferguson in the United States, bring much of the popular discussions of race in the United States into a discussion about race in South Africa, and to think about the post-racial and the nature of the post-racial today as analytic categories. So thank you very much for coming and for enduring this introduction. We hope that you come to many of our events. We have a mailing list, and if you're not signed up for that, please let myself or Lindsay or Thomas know.
You can actually just go to the website, which is www.indexinghumans.org, and just sign up on the front page of the website, and you'll get added on.
So once again, thanks for coming, and I'd like to hand over to Stephen who will introduce Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bernard. We're very pleased to have Professor Andrew Bank from the University of Western Cape, Department of History, with us today. What he's going to talk to is something that we've been grappling with as part of this Indexing the Human project, which is quite diverse. You can go onto the website. The historical interrogation of Volkekunde is one aspect of the overall research program and the seminar series, but it's a very important question. We're based in this particular department here, and we're trying to understand where we've come from. And Eiselen was, as you'll find out, was a founding figure of Volkekunde and comes from this university. So thanks very much, Andrew, for agreeing to come speak to us. I wasn't aware till quite recently that you, in fact, were doing this work, and it really adds a lot. Andrew studied at the University of Cape Town and had his PhD at Cambridge, and has been in the UWC History Department since 1996. where he's currently a professor. He's worked on a number of issues, including slavery and racial ideology in colonial South Africa. He's written a book on the Royal Lake archive on the San history and culture, as well as the history of social anthropology in Southern Africa. Prior to this, focusing on mostly English-speaking women anthropologists and their role within anthropology in this country, but now moving into our space, which we like. We want to unpack. We don't know what the history is. Certain authoritative accounts of Iceland, who and we will talk about, imply that he was more concerned with cultural and ethnic questions, but I think I'm just going to complicate that for us in terms of the relationship between race and culture. And we're very fortunate to have, as a discussant, Professor Kees van der Waal, Professor Emeritus in this department, and we're going to make sure he visits us more and more. And Kees has he has an insider's understanding of Volkekunde in terms of his training around Afrikaner University, and then his break from Volkekunde, which has been very informative in its own thinking. I'm not sure that that is part of what we'll be talking about, but that's a bit of biographical knowledge that is worth thinking about. And his current work has been on culture and identity, particularly Afrikaner cultural identity politics as it manifests in the language debate on this campus and wider. And also has published a recent book on the ethnography of development in the Cape Winelands. And that's the book's called Winelands, Wealth and Work. And is currently busy writing research on issues of transformation, as he calls it, an ethnography of the South African transition from below. So it's based on field work. So we've got two wonderful speakers who will engage on this question of the history of the text. So we'll have 14 minutes or more if we need. We'll have a discussion, and after that we'll open.
Okay, let me begin by saying thank you all for coming. I'm obviously very pleased that there's so many people here. I run a Buddhist meditation class on Monday nights, and usually I get about 5 or 6. So I think this is a kind of vote for my history rather than my meditation intuition skills. I think I should just locate the work. What I'm going to do is, it's quite a long paper, 20,000 words, so it's like a double article. It's based on I suppose the last time we started looking at Iceland about 3 or 4 months ago. But I've done quite a lot of work, and I think I uncovered quite a lot of new information about him. And perhaps I'd like to think somewhat change the way in which we should view Iceland. It's a very important figure as father of the Country Education Act, head of the Iceland Commission, the man associated with the Iceland line, which drew a coloured preference, demarcated the Western Cape as a coloured preference area. In the 1950s, he was a very important politician in the National Party, part of the Broederbond, although seen as somewhat of a left-wing Broederbond. My sense is that people have tended to look at Iceland backwards from that apartheid, especially Cynthia Cross has written mainly a biography on him, although it has chapters on other things called The Seeds of Secular Development. And she's kind of tended to look backwards from the 1950s and her interest in the history of education in the late 1940s and interpret Iceland from that perspective. And perhaps he was a somewhat more ambiguous, well, I won't say liberal, strongly liberal affiliated, but more complex and politically strategic, let's say, figure. The period I'm looking at, I think Iceland was well, as I'll make a case, I think he had a very obvious biological and cultural racism that he inherited from the German tradition. And for various reasons, which I think would be interesting to discuss, this aspect has been suppressed in the literature on Iceland, not only in Cross's book to some extent, actually it's a bit more ambiguous, but certainly Hammond Took's account. I'm no great fan of Hammond Took's history of anthropology, as people might tell you, partly because there are only 20 pages on women in a 200-page book. I've just finished a study which will be published by Cambridge University Press later this year called Pioneers of the Field, South Africa's Women Anthropologists, which is a collective biography of 6 of these women. I think he also underplays the role of Africans in knowledge formation, and the recent book that I edited with my brother through Cambridge, Imperfect Interpreters, Monica Wilson. No, it's called South African Anthropology. Monica Wilson and her interpreters looks at the role that Africans as research assistants and researchers played in her knowledge production. I think there's very little black presence in Hammond Toot's account. The reason why I choose it is I think it's still very influential. I've gone through 2. He was a senior scholar, remains kind of seen often as the standard work. And I think the role of the relationship between Afrikaner and English-speaking traditions is also something I feel he's got very wrong, and that's really what my paper is about. He argues that Eiselen was a co-founder of the British school, the kind of core liberal school, who was the heir of Radcliffe Brown, and together with Shapira, there's a chapter called Consolidating the Tradition, Consolidated Social Anthropology in South Africa. My own reading is that Volkekunde from the outset was a radically different tradition. It had radically different ideas about fieldwork, radically different ideas about race, contrastingly anti-segregationist. Most of the left liberal anthropologists who worked, it was really dominated by Winifred Burnley, who comes out in the book that I'm publishing, I think, in also in quite a different light. She's usually been seen as a kind of middle-of-the-road liberal segregationist sympathizer associated with her husband. She comes across as a very empathetic, dynamic, supervisory presence, and I guess my book's really a restatement for the notion that she was the mother of social anthropology in South Africa. Through the archives that I've read in LA, through the Cooper archive, Johannesburg, the Ellen Hellman archive, and the Hernley archive, the Cricker papers in Durban, which was a 144-page index by the granddaughter, Emily Ann Cricker. I think one pieces together a sense of the impact, an incredible impact you had on these women and the degree of dedication that was involved in building up a new discipline. So in a sense, I'm still interested in gender. This paper has a final section on masculinities, which I still want to develop a little bit, but I think the whole aspect of gender and anthropology hasn't been looked at very significantly, I think. My interest in these women, I know I need to talk about Eiselen a little bit, but my interest in these women, I guess, is they grew up in a very different era. There weren't many women teachers at universities. Just to give you a sense of that, and Monica Hunter, and then she became Wilson, was a professor at UCT. There were 50 professors, and she was the only woman professor in 1954. In 1966, she was the only woman professor among 68 professors. So one gets a sense of quite how recently the environment has been transformed. And my interest is really, I guess it's a critique of blanket notions of anthropology being associated with colonialism and very simplistic depictions, which continue until quite recently, which tend to suggest that all anthropologists were doing the same thing. I guess I'm interested in showing that they're doing radically different things. In the case of this paper, it's looking at an Afrikaans Volkekunde tradition and its origins, and how I think the very ideological assumptions of that tradition were fundamentally different from those of the English liberal tradition that Radcliffe Brown and Hernley, in my analysis, really founded. Usually it's seen as a kind of Radcliffe Brown story, with many, many articles on it, and while he was generally quite a good guy, I think, and certainly a very talented and theoretically intuitive anthropologist. I think things were very much more collaborative in those early years when anthropology began to be started back from scratch. It was a new discipline, which is one of the reasons why women were allowed to enter. It wasn't policed in the same way as laboratory sciences or classics or some kind of older discipline. So that's one of the questions that I looked at in the book. How is it that women were allowed to, uniquely in social anthropology, become the most prominent and internationally respected researchers? 6 or 8 or 9 very prominent international anthropologists were women. Burnley, she didn't publish a monograph, and then all her students. Monica Wilson, who she had informally supervised in Wonderland. Ellen Hellman, who was a major devotee and published articles with her. Isabel, Audrey Richards spent 3 years at WITS, which I also write about in the book, which hasn't really been looked at, taking forward the Hernley legacy. Hilda Cooper, who is the most, I think, underestimated social anthropologist, 4 major monographs. She writes plays, plays, short stories, novels, and has generally been written off as a kind of tribal sympathizer because she had a close relationship with Sabuza, which was really what allowed her to do ethnography in the first place. And Eileen Prichard has also been represented, I think, rather misrepresented as a very conservative liberal who kind of clung to tribalism. So those are the kind of things. I think that, I guess it is important. That's the context. I spent about 5 years working on that book, maybe a little more, looking at archives in London, LA, Durban, and Johannesburg. So this paper really, in a sense, is I followed a curiosity. I read a paper by Peter Callaway, who's here, which was about the Berlin Society missionaries. And when I read his paper, he said that there were different educational traditions. He's trying to understand the history of education in South Africa. Eiselen as founder, as the author of the Bantu Education Act, effectively in 1953, and the head of the Eiselen Commission, represented one different tradition, which he associated with German missionaries, rather than the British mission tradition. There are others, as the American Felt-Stokes tradition, but largely drew a very stark contrast between the assimilationist model of British missionaries who believed that the Africans they trained, and many of the Eastern Cape missionaries became prominent political figures, Jababus and Matthews and others, had the potential to enter modern society in the same way, to be educated along the same lines. And Peter argued that the Berlin tradition had a very different and much more limited, circumscribed concept of how Africans should be trained in the vernacular languages up to primary school with technical skills. And that this was the tradition that Werner Eiselen grew up in. And his paper made a lot of sense to me. You know, it's only this does make sense. I've worked a lot on Monica Hackler, and I know a lot about the local tradition of father was head of that. I spent quite a lot of years working in that archive. So I had a sense that this was a very different tradition. And that got me interested in Eiselen. And then I started reading, you know, I had long been a bit suspicious of Hamilton's account that the Stellenbosch tradition was essentially somewhat liberal in the early days. Largely P.J. Coetzee is the big villain in Hamilton's account. Apartheid and Volkekunde arise around the same time. In the earlier period, the 1920s, the department here was established in 1926. In this earlier period, from 26 to 36, things were very much more fluid in his analysis. And they rely, both Cross and Hamilton, very extensively, I suppose, on institutional records. Stellenbosch University had to appoint somebody to be a member of the Inter-University African Studies Committee. They chose J.A. Engelbrecht, who was a Bantu linguist, also German trained, also very racially conservative. And he and Eiselen were on the committee, and they met with David Reinhold Jones, who was the director of the committee and the editor of Bantu Studies. They met with Isaac Shapra. And on the basis of that evidence of meeting and some letters and things, I think there's emerged what I describe in the book as a mythology of a common purpose. I don't think reading what Eiselen was writing in a lot of detail. He wrote in 3 languages, German, Afrikaans, and English. And I don't know whether it's the spread of languages that has meant that his writings have not been very well analysed, but his writings suggest something very, very different. Okay, so what I think I'll do first is just run through my pictures, because I think they'll give you a sense of the contact of the people I'm dealing with, and then I'll just quickly summarize what I actually say in the paper. If that's all right. So these are his parents. The visual archive is absolutely remarkable. The thing to say about this man is there are no personal papers. There's no Eiselen collection, like there's a Monica and Godfrey Wilson collection, an Eileen Prichard collection, which, as I say, the index is 44 pages. There isn't a single collection of materials on him. So it meant, this is partly why people, I think, have been somewhat economical with the truth in their representations of him. He's appeared as, you know, rather genial, benign racist, when I think my paper shows that. Well, I'll open with the quotes that I have before I run through the paper, just a little texture, and then I'll run through the visuals. So I open with, as an epigraph to the paper, I quote Dunbar Moody. He says, Eiselen was never a racist. Throughout his career, he continued to insist that ethnic rather than racial differences were the most important in South Africa. And then he goes on to say he had a great sympathy for the welfare of Africans, etc. But then I have a quote from Eiselen's first major article, which says, the sexual drive is particularly strong in the African. This date from 1923, he was based in Germany, working under Meinhof, Carl Meinhof, who later became a Nazi, but was a very conservative cultural racist. And Eiselen actually boarded with the guy for 3 months for the first time in Hamburg, and they got on very well. Sexual drive is particularly strong in the African, and therefore the marriage between an African and a white woman is always unhappy. The animal in him will awaken. Then, you know, if we do not lay a new Christian foundation for his spiritual life, and will threaten our white South African society. The sexual urges that are untamed by ethical religious principles will become a source of lasting difficulty to us, because we will have to fear for our mother, our sister, and our wife. The black peril of the German Empire is also our peril. The African stands low spiritually. It is our duty towards our fellow whites to lift him, the African, up, and to bring about a cultural movement for which our children will reap the benefit. Okay, then I also quote something from, I mean, there are many quotes one could take from the paper, but I quote something from, he writes the foreword to a book on the educability of the South African native by somebody called Lawrence Fick, who studied at Harvard and did intelligence tests and planned to show that Africans at the age of 15 were the equivalent of white Europeans at the age of 6 in the language of the day. Maybe it was 14 or 6. Eiselen at the beginning has suggested he could do more research. Okay, writes the preface to this book, and he says, it would be better if we tested Africans in their own languages. Surely the fact that they're in not very good schools and don't have very good teachers and resources makes a difference. But yet he writes the foreword to this book and provides a rounding endorsement of it. And generally people very peculiarly, including sort of enormous respect for Seldom can find an opportunity to criticize, has argued that Eiselen was not particularly concerned about, didn't really believe in intelligence testing, didn't really believe in the idea of innate biological difference. See, the paradigm, the way people have argued with Eiselen is he was only interested in cultural difference, and later he came to analysing this in a kind of discourse of development, upliftment of the Bantu, and his later writings are filled with it. They almost read like something from a business manual. The timber can be harvested, the Africans will do this. You know, it's a positive language of development. And in a sense, I'm arguing that people seem to be taken in by this later strategic political discourse of apartheid, and that the evidence of his actual writings and what he himself had to say, sadly without our private letters, reveal a very different kind of picture. So in 1939 he says, along with saying that the native is not educable in the same way, this book has shown it, we have to accept it. The findings might need to be fine-tuned scientifically because we want a rigorous science, but the findings are overall, the sense is very clearly that Bantus need to be educated in a different way. Since 1939 he went on to write the Eiselen Commission report and introduced the Bantu Education Act. And so he says, the quote I have here is, my office boy, who carries out all other instructions faithfully, appears to be quite incapable of replacing chairs and tables in the correct position after he has cleaned the room. The failure of the natives to show improvement in the repetition test of this particular type, those relating to their spatial sense, does not come as a surprise. Dr. Fick has shown convincingly that the native is not educable in the same way as the European. Okay, I think a bigger question, which I can address later in the talk, is why historians, why have people been unwilling to tell this kind of story when I'm telling? In my own reading of early 19th century, I came to the 20th century quite late, but I think there has been a tendency in research terms, there has been a tendency to conflate, Pamela Reynolds talks of an adequate reading. When you look at a work in its time, you need to understand the context of its production and the context of its audience. And I think in many ways, a lot of the readings, it seems to me, of racial ideology in the early 20th century are not adequate. In that it seems to me, just from my limited work on Iceland, that, and on the women anthropologists, that fundamentally segregation is the issue that people are looking at. And the core left liberal anthropologists who were impassioned politically throughout their lives, got involved in activism for the Liberal Party, etc., were driven by anti-segregationism. Most of them were Jewish, came from relatively marginal Jewish backgrounds, experienced anti-Semitism, Max background as well. But they were driven by the idea that there was a universalism, and when they record Winifred Hernley's teachings, that's what they remember. Winifred Hernley taught us that we were all part of the same society, that there was such a thing as rights that belonged to everybody in that society. And that was fundamentally their framework. The details of their writings, they might have experimented with fiction as they repeated it. They might have gone to the same field site for 50 years as I repeated it. However, they chose to act out that career path. It was driven by that fundamental political assumption, which had already been laid in place in the undergraduate lectures and the postgraduate research and continuing. What Eiselen and the Volkekunde tradition, or certainly Eiselen and his students, I can't really say, I think it was beyond 1930s, it was based on, as these quotes suggest, a radically different assumption. My argument is that the assumption really comes from German imperial and missionary literature. I think to associate it with Nazi ideology would be a mistake. I don't think we know enough about that. I think there was obviously a continuity between German imperial literature and Nazi ideology. But what Eiselen taught his students and what he wrote about and what he learned was a literature that came out from the German Empire. These were ethnologists when Germany colonized Africa from 1884 until they withdrew around the middle of the First World War. In the late 1880s and the 1890s, 1900s and early 1910s, there was a very large literature on the African colonies, which was deeply infused by the physical anthropology, which was a very dominant aspect of the German tradition, much more dominant than any other tradition. And German anthropology, as Dr. Gordon has shown, was very much more popular. There were like 500 members of the German Anthropological Society in the 1880s at a time when Britain had maybe 150 or 200. It was very, very active concern, but it was strongly oriented towards the physical. And Eiselen's early writings show that very strongly. And I think the assumptions of classification were borrowed largely from a German tradition of classification, in his case, though, that was linguistic. Primarily, he was trained as a linguist. Johannes Antoni Engelbrecht was trained as a linguist. They were trained in Bantu Tala, and if you look at Engelbrecht's papers at Stellenbosch, the lectures are, you know, the finest little points about morphology and the consonant and the classes. It's about a tiny mindset of pigeonholing, placing of data, which we conceive very scientifically, and this is something I argue that we inherited, Eiselen inherited from Meinhof, who was the great figure of his day. It's become rather unpopular since, because he was exposed, well, in a sense, the methodology of linguistic moved in a radically different direction from classification towards spoken languages. In the 1950s, under Greenberg, exposed his politics of races and wrote about a different kind of methodology, which relates to the spoken word rather than the grammatical form. And essentially what Eiselen brings to Stellenbosch is an obsessive interest in splitting classification and grammatical forms, but also one that's infused with the racial ideology that he had learned in Weimar, Germany in the early 1920s, but which in fact relied on text. All the texts he cites in this article are texts that date from the 1890s and 1900s. Der Hebero, Veda on Didamara, which talks about their forms of fire worship, etc., their forms of primitivism, very exoticized, very often based on close examination of physical features as a intercept, etc. So that's the legacy inheritance. This is completely different from the social anthropological tradition. Not only is it not sociological in the sense of Radcliffe Brown and Pinchot and the interests and those interests, the social anthropologists work themselves weren't at all interested in physical features. Monica Wilson already, as a student at Cambridge, talked about the skull measuring wash to which she was being subjected occasionally in the Cambridge laboratory. They had no real interest in finding out whether people's heads were bigger or smaller and measuring them. They were interested in societies that you studied working as working, I suppose they then taught functional units, and you had to study them in the field. So the implications of this for field work, you know, one thing that's very radically different, and that I haven't developed in the paper, but I'm still writing about, is really about what conception of field work. Field work, as James Clifford and others have shown, needs to be looked at historically. James Clifford gives us a wonderful example of a helicopter being used for geologists wanting to study, and they go around in a helicopter, and can this be field work? Can you do field work in a helicopter? So, you know, in general, his writings have shown the notion of what field work is differs radically. You can't just assume field work is this, and I think that the comparison between the two traditions shows that very strongly. I know much more about the woman in the social anthropological tradition, but largely it was a process of enormously patient. If you were a very good anthropologist and you had the resources to be in the field for 1 to 3 years, which was generally 2 years was considered standard. We learned a language, right? We had linguistic skills already, like Countess Kosa or you learn different bits, like people learn Zulu, Swati, and then you go into the field, and then you stay there, as you know, and then you do probably experience, including Kiasi and Kudu. You go and you interact with people, and you participate in events. My sense of what the Volkekunde tradition was doing was rather different. Their attitude was too detached to be able to form what the discourse was really one of intimacy. If you read the Malinovsky and his students, they will talk about intimacy. The idea is to become intimate with people, to know their language, to understand the native or African point of view. To do so, you have to have linguistic skills. And now, in the case of these Volkekunde, they have linguistic skills, in fact, sometimes superior linguistic skills to those of their English counterparts. But they had a racial ideology, it seems to me, both from Iceland and his students, that didn't allow for a concept of close contact and full cultural, what we would call today, cultural relativism. They weren't really interested in understanding the other culture in its own terms and getting fully immersed in the discourse of that culture to represent it to people as something worthy of study, something of interest, and in the context of South Africa and interwar period, something that was rather radical and revolutionary. That's what I feel about the British social anthropologists. 90% of white South Africans didn't believe African culture was worthy of study. They didn't believe it was particularly complicated or interesting. They didn't believe there were particularly diverse or complex kinship structures. So what those people were writing about in Ponderland or Uvenle and Manana was in fact something rather unusual. We might see them as limited liberals in retrospect. But in fact, what they were doing in terms of the depth of cultural knowledge they were producing across 550 pages in Reaction to Conquest, in its first book of 4 editions, was rather revolutionary in my view. And I think people have underestimated that. But in the case of the Afrikaans-speaking tradition, I think they were doing something very different. I think the notion of field work was very much more like a tour. There was a collection. They collected objects, and I see it on your program. You've got something on the museum. The museum was founded right at the beginning by Eiselen and Kutzer took over, Peter Kutzer. And I think that whole project of classifying Eiselen is known to have taught very extensively using slides of different groups, clearly classifying people visually for his students. Some of his articles, in fact, he's got one of them that we referred to on the Kunstnederheid Ubuntu, which is about crafts. And he argues that people need to be taught the value of their own crafts and encouraged to produce them. And it's written in the early 1930s, and he's becoming more sympathetic to the idea of promoting Bantu culture and separate development. Yeah, okay, so let me go through the slides, and then, yeah, if there's any more time, I'll probably have my say, but I'll just show you really cut Iceland. So recall that we don't have a private archive. These are all sourced from, yeah, wonderful. I've had the most amazing support. If you need to use the Stellenbosch University archive, you have the most incredible resource there, somebody called Caroline Briet. She is a wonderful research assistant and, yeah, knows an immense amount about where you can find information. And she has scanned. These come from the Cape Archives. So a woman called Dora Smuts donated them in 1966. She was a great fan of the Berlin Missionary Society. These are Iceland's parents. There's no reason why we should know what they look like. This is Gustav Eiselen, who himself was a great segregationist. He was the mission superintendent from around the time Eiselen was born in 1899. His father was mission superintendent and believed very strongly in a separate education. He was strongly sympathetic to the politics of the South African Republic, the Volksraad, and believed in a clear divide between Africans not participating in politics. He believed that African chieftains should be destroyed. He did have an interest in African culture in that he took his son to visit the baby chief, and there was some degree of, yeah, language was important, partly in evangelizing. Okay, these are the little Icelands. Who would have thought that we'd have a picture of 5 baby Icelands? This is Werner and his siblings. This his oldest brother Siegfried gets killed in the First World War at the Battle of Verdun. He fights for the Germans, and at this stage, Werner Eiselen was at school at King Edward's High School. I think his father sent him. Exactly why he was sent to an English school, I'm not sure. He was homeschooled, as were many of these, as were many of the disciples of Iceland, actually, largely rural guys like Iceland, came to Stellenbosch, a small town, part of a new urbanized Christian nationalist Afrikaner identity that somebody called Dukasan is written about, I think, quite well, most interestingly. Anyway, so that's his eldest brother, Mrs. Gotthilf. I must still find out more about him, but he becomes a professor at the University of Rochester. You guys might know something about him. And I'm embarrassed to say that daughters Maria, Magdalena, and I'm not sure, Irma, I think Irma said one. I suspect, you piece together, basically I'm a storyteller, so I pieced together a bit of a story about his childhood. Until the age of 13, he's still with him. I imagine he might have sat around the table with these two little Icelands over here, with his father and mother giving the lessons, which was like giving Volkekunde, and reading of German texts. I think he could speak Sotho as a boy, North Sotho, and quite a lot of the missionary texts on Sotho. And he grew up at Botshabelo, which was a pretty successful example of a urban society mission station. It had a few hundred people in the year foundation, 1867. But it's always very political. The foundation was always very strongly associated with the Transvaal Republic and I guess pro-Trekker ideology. Okay, then we go to, this was his school. After King Edward's, he left King Edward's, and he's got a story about why he left. He said the boys at King Edward's, I attended, he wrote later, this is to a Stellenbosch audience. One of his, he gave public addresses at Stellenbosch. He was kind of quite a common public intellectual, I guess. Although he appears, I'm surprised at how few times he appears in Senate and other kinds of records. But he gave an address, for example, to 450 people in 1929 on the native question. One of the things that was quite a lot of people have read. He spoke in this talk. He said, I attended a pure English school, and there I often heard, this is my translation from Afrikaans, and there I often heard from my classmates that I was a square head, even though I'm a long-skulled person. A German is a square head regardless of how he looks, and he belongs to a less privileged race or form than the Englishman. Okay, so I think there's a sense in which, we don't have many details about his childhood, but I think there's a sense in which he was somewhat traumatized. He left the school and did his matric at an Afrikaans school. His brother had gone to the school, but because it was during the war, and the same is true, Ellen Hellman, who was also German, although a Jewish German, had very evocative, she was struck down by British classmates in the pod and taunted, and remembered this in her late life. It was an interview with her a few years before she died. It was really a very, very painful memory. So while this might not sound, it might be couched in the language of scientific grace, I think underlying the story is a sense of being taunted, stereotyped by English boys. And yeah, in a sense, we're really tracing the evolution of a German Afrikaner nationalist, because that's what Eiselen was. He was German born, and he came to affiliate himself with Afrikaner nationalism. And largely that happened at Pretoria University. He became a member at Pretoria University, and there again, we always rely on, it was the research assistant Ria van America who provided this material from it was then called the Transvaal University College, from the student magazine, which showed that Iceland joined the Afrikaner Studentenbond. We went to Bloemfontein to a conference where they discussed the importance of being taught in their own language. And yeah, they voted in favour of separate education for Afrikaans and English. And later, they also, I won't read you, a young nation with a glittering future, blah, blah, blah. It's a kind of strong Afrikaner nationalism in their reports, which Russell Martin edited on my paper. So people haven't read it. Yeah, so that's when I see the turning point for Meinhof. Pretoria University is a very good student, gets a first at school, gets a first in the Taalbond, goes to study at Pretoria, and he studies classics, which I think is also important, because in a sense he gets an appreciation of ancient Greek and Roman culture, the sense of the genealogy of the European, and I think this was important, the counterpart to his ideas about primitivism. Okay, so that's his school. Here is in the tennis team. In the last section of the paper, which does need to be developed, I really look at masculinities. And in a sense, the image of Iceland that's come down to us and that cross-develops is one. I'll show you a picture right at the end of the display, which is kind of the symbol of that image. It's Iceland very reserved. In fact, he was not a particular big mouth. He was a quiet, scholarly, reserved individual. People remembered him as determined, disciplined. You developed a respect for him. But he was a relatively quiet man. And I think in a sense, I'm trying to unsettle that image a bit. And he became, as I show, he became head of the Berkeley Crew Club. One of the members of the Berkeley Crew Club, and I believe it's a very vibrant organization. I've met people who were studied here in the 60s. I've met people, there's a woman at the DRC archive said her son was very active in the Berkeley Crew Club and had recently put all the annual reports on the internet, made them available. So it was, Eiselen was a founder member of R.W. Wilcox, a applied psychologist, who was a very senior figure in the university and involved in poor life research largely. And then Eiselen became captain, and P.J. Kurtzer were captain. And collectively, they were the head, what they called the Toolfather, for equivalent of about 15 years. And while women were allowed in the club, they were very clearly treated differently. The men controlled the club. And so I'm trying to, I suppose, explore the idea that Eiselen also had a somewhat more outgoing masculinity than the apartheid bureaucrat who hid away shuttling files about country education in his office in the late 50s. And that in Stellenbosch, these public speeches that he gave to 500 people, this role of leadership in the Berkeley Crew Club, and this nurturing. He was enormously successful in nurturing a new generation of students. The UCT produced one PhD in the interwar years in anthropology. Eiselen himself supervised either 4 or 5 PhD students, including the rugby player Werner Eiselen, who did a BA in Volkekunde, he did an MA in Volkekunde, and he did a PhD on the PhD in Volkekunde. It's largely a kind of classification, and yeah. So anyway, that's him. Eiselen on the right here, and is that okay? We don't have any other young pictures of him. I was pleased to just even find this one. The only pictures we had were older portraits of the ancient Eiselen. Okay, here's the Berkeley Crew Club. Now, I'm very interested in how the address of the Berkeley Crew Club members changes, and even the ways in which they're referred to. Okay, it did involve, this is not P.J. Kurtzer, this is somebody else. We compared portraits. But anyway, Dr. W. Eiselen, they were called captain. What did the Berkeley Crew Club do? Well, I think I haven't, as I say, explored this fully, but I think it was important. The links between rural and urban, in this case, small town identity, was very important in the emerging of Afrikaner nationalism. Generally, scholars of Afrikaner nationalism and masculinity argue that the 1930s was a major time of transition. The manly ideal had perhaps been more open, more susceptible to English and other identities. And in the 1930s, there's a very marked move towards what we might associate with Christian nationalism. There's a very specific urban middle class identity. This is what Dutton argues. And certainly the profiles of Eiselen and all his students show they were almost all rural ones. Donnie Craven grew up on a farm in the Free State. P.J. Kurtzer grew up on a farm in Clark. Many of them were homeschooled. They generally went to Afrikaans high schools, and they came to Stellenbosch as very young men. P.J. Kurtzer was here, you'll see a picture of him, at the age of 18 or 19. He later went on to train heads of department of about 8 or 10 universities in South Africa. He was the major figure in Volkekunde. That's a really direct disciple of Eiselen. Okay, so here's Eiselen. Look at the dress, and then this is how it changes. In 1935, this is Eiselen. This is the only full picture we have of him. But I don't really know the details about what that uniform represents, but it looks like, you know, I know the Voortrekker youth and people wore kind of khaki outfits, but there's a very clearly a very, very different sense of ethnic affiliation, which must have been Eiselen was the captain. He made the decision to change this, and this is indeed how it remains. And he stays, he's head of the Berkeley Crew Club from 31 to 36. That's P.J. Kurtzer in 37 who takes over. So his son, effectively in the Volkekunde tradition, takes over as the head. And I don't know if Conradi was a student, because there was a Conradi who studied a master's in Volkekunde. And then this is Kurtzer, and I think a much more imposing kind of picture of Kurtzer as the head of the Berkeley Crew Club in 1939. And here the name's Oom. He was later remembered as Oom Piet, and here's Oom Jannie as well. I think there was a sense of a brotherhood in this. Even though women were allowed in this club, the recollections about this club suggest strongly that it was it's a kind of breeding ground or a seed for masculine identity and masculine fostering and kind of brotherhood. And I think the fact that they toured, where did they tour? Well, it was about, so they went on mountain top, but they were incredibly active. They'd gone 3 expeditions a year for 10 days. I don't know if Iceland went on all of those, but they went around the country and were a very important link, therefore, in this new urban Afrikaner middle class identity and rural Afrikaners like themselves who come to the towns. And so I think there was a sense of fostering connections with the country through this touring. And I think, as I say, what they saw as their field work has something to do with the kind of style of the camp. And in fact, that's how Kutsa remembered. He traveled to Swaziland, was his first tour. He went with the ethnographer, and he stayed with the Dominee and his wife. And the Dominee and his wife went to the sites. They had hot springs in Swaziland, and they went off to these hot springs on a tour. And it was a sense of camping. They camped out. There were stories. There was a sense of trying to find out some information. Although in those days he was a linguist. His first study, MA study, which was under Ilmbruck, rather than Iceland, was in Bantu linguistics. And then the library burned down in 32, and he couldn't study linguistics anymore. And then he had to do ethnology under Iceland. Okay, these are the guys. These are the mana who. The fact is that, you know, in the later tradition of Volkekunde, as Kiers will tell you, I think Stellenbosch is the only place, I stand corrected here because he knows, others know more than I do, but my impression is that there's only been one Volkekundige female who was lecturing the whole tradition of the Volkekunde at universities, and in that case even only for 2 or 3 years, and she was at the University, Orde Krige, in 1961 and 62 or something like that. But basically it's a masculine tradition. So my argument in the paper is that Eiselen founded both the racially inflected, deeply racially informed nature of Volkekunde as a system of classification, both linguistic and racial, but also the male-dominated nature of that enterprise. And these are his students. That's PJ Kursa on the left. He's just arrived. He's a young guy. He's seen his homestead where he lives, where he grew up on the farm. He recalls it as having been burnt down by the British. He recalls his brother as taking part in the 1914 Afrikaner rebellion. He remembers his brothers. He's one of about 8 or 9 siblings. They're all brothers, actually, one of 8 or 9 brothers. And in general, they seem to have a lot of siblings, this caste. And he comes to Stellenbosch as a very impressionistic young man, 19 years old, and then starts Volkekunde right from the outset. First year that Iceland's here, 1926, goes through the ranks, takes over as head of department. This is Skuman, the writer. This is Danny Craven in 31. These are all taken around 30, some of them 27, some of them 28, but let's say around 1930. These are 3 pictures of P.J. Skuman. I have the most sympathy for his anthropology. I must say, I've read their PhDs and MAs in the library here. And I think he did have a degree of contact, although he later became rather more conservative, it seems, from Robert Gordon's account of him. I think that he did have some sense of, he was very fluent in Zulu, and he had some sense of connection. And while he fell out, Hilda Beamer hammered him in a Bantu Studies special issue while she was doing fieldwork in Swaziland. It became quite a big symbol of division between Hernley and the English-speaking anthropologist and Iceland, who was outraged that something was published in the journal that criticized his student. But I think he had a degree of connection. My sense is there was some understanding of Zulu culture, there was an attempt to understand kingship, and the much greater than the other anthropologists who seemed to be much more interested, like P.J. Kursa, in classification and kind of grids of knowledge. He also wrote very well. You'll see something. He became a famous writer of hunting stories. That's Skuman. This is Skuman in 28, 29, and in 32. So this is exactly the time that he's studying under Eiselen. It's absolutely remarkable. We have these photographs. If you were doing the history of UCT, you would never have photographs from 1928. The reason, apparently, I'm told by the archivist Carl Meinhof, made these all available to me, is that there was only really one major photographic studio that took pictures of students in this period. It's an English name, they're a double-barrel thing, and they kept this remarkable record. I mean, what's there to say that you know how, let's say I was doing research in the UCT, one of Radcliffe Brown's students, I would have no idea what that person looked like. I couldn't just say, well, plug P.J. Conradi into the search engine and come up with that, you know. And somehow about 90% of my requests have produced
photographic images. So yeah, that's in your university archive, and that's done in Craven 31. These are the PhD guys. There isn't one from Andries Albertus van Schalkwyk, who did his PhD on Johannesburg and grew up in Johannesburg, so unusually was an urban guy. These are the MA students, and well, these three I'm not sure. I haven't seen their theses. This is Van Biljon, JP Van Biljon, PJ Conradi. But anyway, I think you get a sense. The impression here is one of urbanized, middle-class, urbane Afrikaner identity from boys who grew up on farms, who were homeschooled till 13, and are taking on a new cultural identity, in my view, and one which was very important in relation to, I suppose, what we might call Broederbonde in a looser sense. Eiselen himself did become a member of the Broederbond, as did Kurt Engelbrecht, but not Don Craven, if I'm right. I think he remained outside. Okay, I took this just because of the image quality. This is PJ Skuman. He started becoming a popular author already while he was a student, and this is in Die Huisgenoot. If any of you don't have a research project and you're an historian and you want to work with Afrikaans materials, the Huisgenoot is the most amazing. Really is incredible because it was very, very visual right from the outset, far more visual than it is today. I suppose today they're kind of very glossy, lots of adverts. It's a fascinating cultural resource. I haven't seen many people. I know Deborah Posel's worked a bit with it, but and really it's also very popular. So there's a very direct sense of voice that isn't mediated through intellectual language of a journal or something like that. You get a strong sense of participation. Anyway, this is a short story. He wrote a short story about, it includes dice throwing. It's about a kind of a diviner, a Zulu diviner. And the story talks about how the hunter, he's basically a hunter, and later he writes these hunting stories, had contact with the diviner, and this diviner came to him right at the end of the guy had somehow got lost. The diviner, fallen apart from his, I don't know, white friend, wandered and then came back to him, but had been attacked by a leopard and was about to die. And it's really, I think he writes rather well. I'm not a very good judge of writing in Afrikaans because I'm pretty Anglicized, I suppose. But my sense is I like his writing in his thesis and in the story. But the content, as you can see, is of a rather exoticized. I don't know if those guys, generally it was, dice throwing was something they seemed quite interested in. PJ Kurtzer wrote a small thesis on dice throwing. I think it's kind of symbolizes the sense of the exoticized, the diviner. The person who was of interest was the witch doctor, the diviner, the rainmaker. These were, it wasn't really society, I suppose, it wasn't agricultural practices and what people were growing, as Audrey Richards was particularly interested in land, labour and diet, that fundamentally interested people. It was the kind of sense of a somewhat unusual spirituality and strange practices. And this man was a dice thrower, but I don't know that he's holding any, he seems to be symbolizing the attack. Okay, 2 minutes. Oh, this is in the wrong order, but anyway, that's Eiselen right at the end of his life. In a sense, this is how he's remembered. I think that's a somewhat grim portrait. There's another one. Well, let's skip out on that. Okay, there's one of him in the 1950s, which I think largely symbolizes his bureaucratic, dry, grey identity. And I think he was a more interesting, if very much more racist character than has generally been depicted. So I think that's it.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yes, you want to talk for 10 or so minutes, and then we'll open it up. Okay.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Andrew, for a fascinating story, especially if you read the paper that he has made available, so you can ask for that. I think he brings very important new insights, rethinking the role of an important Afrikaner intellectual and bureaucrat in the formative years of Volkekunde at Stellenbosch. And he shows the continuity of racist ideas and the works of an important thought leader in the formative decades of the 20th century, which have been denied up to now. These have got implications for social science and for understanding identity politics in South Africa and the world. What does it mean to say someone is a racist in the past and the present? It's a story that Andrew Banks tells about Werner Eiselen, perhaps only a pleasantist interpretation, as some would have it. I think it's important in the light of the critique on the launch of the Indexing the Human project, because it's linked to the interpretation of the history of Stellenbosch University that's coming up in a 2 years' time, the centenary. And what do we do with the legacy of 70 years of being an ethno-nationalist and racist project as this university? And why is there a strong reaction to the initial claims that Banks has just supported when it was made by the Indexing the Human project? On the most basic level, this emerging reinterpretation is an extremely important contribution to the study of the history of anthropology in South Africa. It's a growing field. Important texts have been forthcoming. He mentioned several of them. Now, Andrew Banks' study of the father of Volkekunde and one of the most important architects of apartheid helps us to make the scope larger and more intensive, more deep. The basic question is, how influential was Volkekunde with regard to the formation of policy in apartheid times in relation to the church and the political party? What were the basic facts? Because these are contested. Then contributes by revisiting the same information that was available all the time to everybody, reinterpreting them, turning the tables on older interpretation, and showing the whitewashing of sophisticated intellectuals like Eiselen. So his contribution to Indexing the Human is in the interest in the past and present of classification and forms of exclusion that we are also focusing on. And there's a wider interest in the history of anthropology in Africa. I've just returned from the workshop in Cameroon, where this was taken forward in broader African sense by Francis Nyanyo and associates. Okay. The question is, what is the implication of this? Why are people so easily upset about these issues? For instance, Herman Gilliamer and Leopold Skos on the exposure of the links between Afrikaner thought and German racial science. And then ultimately, how does this reflect on classifications and divisions that are relevant today in terms of race, minority, culture? The argument of Bank is basically that the changing connection between the concepts of race and culture in South African anthropology are historically important. There's a close link between the political context of Afrikaner nationalism, scientific racism, German linguistic and anthropological theory, and Afrikaner anthropology in the 1920s and 1940s. And that's fully set out in the full paper. Extremely important reading. Now, the historiography of anthropology has been dazzled by the positive presentation of Afrikaner politics, framed as good intentions and development, and as a move away from outspoken racism. And Eiselen, in this regard, as Bank has indicated, is then portrayed as a sophisticated and different from the radicals of the Osaba Brandwag, Elof, Cronje, etc. But there's a need for a radical reinterpretation of the racial politics of Eiselen's anthropology on the basis of revisiting the available documents and studying new evidence, as Bank has done. This evidence shows that Eiselen was formed in a German nationalistic context in which Protestant ideas about mission and nation were important reference. His German studies in association with Meinhof and Westermann in the pre-Nazi period are brought out in the paper. And both these contexts, the mission and the German study period, planted in him a racist understanding that was often implicit and underlying his cultural theory, rather than the crude racist stereotyping that one would find on other levels, like the political. He was increasingly associated with Afrikaner nationalism from his days at the University of Pretoria, and he started at Volkekunde at Stellenbosch. In his early period at Stellenbosch, he became a public intellectual with a strong use of racist language. Later, less so. He moved to a stronger emphasis on culture, seen as based on racial difference. So here's the important point, I think, theoretically, is the connection between race and culture and how that continues to exist into present times. He's pessimistic about integration and he holds on to white superiority. Andrew Bank convincingly shows the continuity of ideas in the work of Eiselen, and of course, I have experience of what came after Eiselen, which is very strongly linked to that. And he provides the material and analysis to see this continuity in racial science in Eiselen's public speeches, teaching, and ethnographic writing. Okay, the method of Bank. He revisits the evidence and carefully generates new evidence by close reading of available text. My experience of being a student and lecturer in the Volkekunde tradition at Pretoria University confirms the reading of the work of Eiselen by Bank. What I was fed in the late 1960s and early 1970s was based on an underlying racism, mostly muted, tied to the teaching of essentialist racial differences, with an emphasis on incompatibility, and based on that infrastructure of ideas, the study of culture and ethnos, developed by the most important student of Eiselen, my Professor Peter Kurtzer. And I think Andrew Bank has illustrated his powerful use of methods and tells the story in a convincing way. I've got a couple of questions. What was the intellectual network, you don't need to answer them, around Eiselen in the university? His links with zoology, like C.S. Grobelaar, who have worked on physical anthropology, and this is specifically tying in with the work of Hendrik Walters, who's working on those issues. What about theology? What about his relationships with other people with a German background, like van Warmerdorp? It's conceivable that Eiselen brought the racial classification instruments which got us going in the Indexing the Human project with him from Germany, or that he ordered them for use in the department. And where is the skin color scale? What was the real influence of Eiselen and later Volkekundiges, for instance, Kurtz and van Eden, on the formation of the apartheid policy? We've got his Eiselen's 1929 lecture. We know his pamphlet on separate development. His and his students' influence in the FRK, in the church and the National Party. But more work needs to be done in archives of these organizations. Gilliamer claims that the church was the main formative influence on the National Party politics, and he's averse to claims that Volkekundiges have a strong influence. So there's an interesting question to be pursued further. What was the actual influence of this thinking that Eiselen so strongly planted here in the political life of South Africa? And then, Eiselen was a member of the Nieuwe Orde. It was started by Oswald Piro, and it was in favor of the dictatorship. This is very late, and when we talk about Nazi ideas and so on, so what does that mean in his life? What about the Oswald Brandwag? We know that Kurtzer was an Oswald Brandwag member, and others, Skuman. And then Eiselen renounced his German citizenship in 1939. What were his motivations? And then how to handle the accusation of presentism in this reinterpretation. The argument is that racism in the early 20th century was a cutting-edge international science, and that we cannot judge it with the insights of today. That I think we can accept. But was Eiselen a racist in today's terms? For me, the question is, what kind of a racist? We have to look at the evidence of physical anthropology, scientific racism, and the merging of race and culture. And I think much more analytical work is needed on these questions. And then how can we move away from a dualism in terms of racism and scientific racism versus the opposite, that claims there is no racism, and move towards an understanding of the historical and current reality of shades of grey, if I can call it that. These shades need to be theorized in more detail and connected to global debates about what it is to be human. Okay, to end, the importance of this work. I think Bank is rewriting the history of Volkekunde. It's important for understanding the building of a separate intellectual tradition at the most important Afrikaner university. This can be taken further by finding personal records, for instance, letters in mission and personal archives. So Bank, you can go on. And I think what you have started in the last part of your paper is very promising, where you look at the biographies of specific persons, like students and colleagues, and it reveals the class position and the shared understandings around gender, body, community, and social hierarchy. And I think this work has implications for reading South African politics and social science more broadly, understanding the origin and formation of apartheid and the involvement of social scientists. It's very important for teaching, it's important for public anthropology, for getting to grips with the Stellenbosch University history. The understanding of the network of sociology, psychology, zoology, sports studies, etc. at this university is something that is asking for a link and insightful analysis. So you show that a crude biological determinism can be translated into cultural determinism based on racist ideas of superiority. And I think the specific contribution of your work is the reading of Eiselen as being caught up in a nexus of mission, proto-Nazi thought, Afrikaner politics, and more broadly South African politics. What he did with these influences and how he was an agent in the structures that he lived in. Crude racism was turned into the strategic use of culture and language. It was taken further in the work of his students until the 1990s. One can call this nowadays the color of culture. Important analysis for reinterpretation of the history of anthropology in this work. Eiselen's work exemplifies how scientific racism becomes the study of culture, and it has real impacts on the educational, land and labor politics in South Africa and the suffering of millions of people. So this is not airy-fairy intellectual history and some, unimportant thing. It had and has enormous influence. But beyond that, the issue is about more than Eiselen, I think. It has implications for the politics of white minority identification, the concept of Afrikaner. One can be certain of this analysis to be questioned and being opposed in the public domain, especially in the Afrikaans press. So watch this space in the burger in a couple of days. This is a serious challenge and needs to be handled very carefully. But there's another danger, and I'll stop there. This is the danger of stereotyping people like Eiselen and those associated with him, and taking the insights that are laid bare by the careful historical analysis of Bang to a place where they can be abused by journalists, politicians, and others in such a way that they play into the hands of those who have a much less comprehensive and balanced view of history and politics. The same historical material can be abused in order to distance oneself from racism, essentialism, and political guilt by casting one part of the white population of the country, Afrikaans-speaking whites, and of the world for that matter, as the historical face of racist evil. However, Afrikaners as a population category are not the ultimate racists of the world. These views are reflected to many uncomfortable sites today in universities, including this space. Maybe sociology, in our history, psychology, in curricula, in politics, in the growing exclusions of populations, in world politics and its associated lethal inequalities. In South Africa these days manifest themselves in the form of xenophobia, Africanism, the taalstrijd, white privilege, black privilege, class divisions and gender relations. Volkekunde and its co-travelers are not dead. I think you've touched on the important concept of cultural racism. It is now more clear than before that there is an ongoing challenge to make intellectual and political sense of the history of ideas in the context of personal agency and life history, as well as political and economic context, in which open or hidden essentialisms are strategically employed for contestations based on racism. Thanks to Andrew Bang for contributing to our own search for meaning in our intellectual past in a pioneering and extremely useful and orienting way at a crucial point in this process. Sorry for speaking so quickly, but we have little time. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thanks very much to both of you. I think you've already helped us think through these questions of historical formation, of Volkekunde, and much more. And let's open it up for discussion. We can take 3 to 4 questions or comments at a time, and hopefully get a couple of rounds. And could people just briefly say who you are? Okay.
Hi, my name is Ashley from the Theology faculty. You mentioned several times, or emphasized several times, the fact that Iceland and a number of the people who trained were from rural backgrounds, especially relating to the German missionary movement. Now, what is the is that connected to the development of his at least paternalism, and then maybe at most superiority of the over the black people in the rural areas? Or what's the focus of your emphasis? Because it was a number of times that you mentioned where these people come from.
Okay, Peter, Sue.
Thanks to both kids. I've been scratching around on this area for a little while myself, and I'm so glad that it's come into focus for people like yourself. I'm talking to you as a and I'm sure the question you must be asking yourself is, why has nobody ever done this before? This is pretty central stuff, particularly to this university. And it's partly the explanation that Andrew gave, and that is that there aren't Eiselen papers. Why there aren't Eiselen papers, I've never discovered. Nobody has an answer to it. But he doesn't seem to be like the kind of man who wouldn't have kept private papers. Anyway, so that's part of it. But partly also, maybe people haven't wanted to ask these questions. I think somebody well, okay. So looking back, I would say if you're interested in this, if you're thinking of doing this kind of research, two things Andrew's given as kind of possible leads. At the moment in Germany, there's a project which is in its second phase at the moment, looking at the history of German Lutheran missions in southern Africa. And I'm involved in that. So he said, that's how I got into it. And I think that's something that is really worth looking at. What was German Lutheran mission in Africa? Not just South Africa, but also. What were they up to? What were the connections? And we mustn't be scared of this Nazi thing, because as Andrew says, it's much more about German imperial and missionary ideology than it's not necessarily about Nazis. There's a whole other story there that one needs to focus on. You might get to Nazis or you might not. But so there's that. There's a way back, and the connections between that and the Dutch Reformed Church and what was going on this campus in the 1920s, in exactly the time when this department was being set up. There was a whole kind of heresy set of trials going on here. So, and then the other side of the story, and I'm interested in education, is what did this man do when he got into power? Because that's blank. Cynthia Cross doesn't talk about this at all. We have no idea what he actually did in, what is it, 10, 15 years when he was running the Department of Bantu Education. How long is it, Andrew? 10 years?
Well, yeah, he's Secretary for Native Affairs.
Yeah, and then...
Well, until 1960 when he resigned.
Yeah.
Not in a state of disillusion, as Andy suggests.
Yes.
Pierce has put me onto papers that he wrote about Herzog, what a great corpse comes back that Herzog remained, and speeches he gave at the unveiling of the Herzog statue. I mean, Herzog really was his political idea.
But here you run into another massive roadblock, and that is that the archive of the Bantu Education Department, as far as I've been able to find, do not exist. You go to Pretoria, you ask for the Bantu Education Department archives, they're not there. So there are roadblocks trying to work out what this guy was up to. That doesn't prevent one. So thank you, Andrew, for opening.
Thanks, Peter. Sue, and we'll take a, hope you don't mind, we'll take about 5 now. Just
just a quick one. Sue from King University of the Western Cape. Yeah, I want to come back to the question of the Lutheran missions. There's a kind of a logical inconsistency here that I don't understand in Eiselen's thinking and his own mission background and his the racist ideas of his father, the mission superintendent. On the one hand, you quote him, the paper doesn't have page numbers, but it's the paper with footnote 46, as saying that Protestant Christianity requires a special kind of reasoning, a certain reasoned cultural intelligence, which only you discover later, he thinks only Nordic peoples have. And then further on in the paper, we discover that he clearly thought that Africans didn't have this kind of reasoned intelligence. There's a clear link for him between African religion, which he classifies as superstition, and Protestant Lutheranism, which is, you know, intelligent and reasoning. So then my question is what were the missionaries doing? If they, I mean, what were they looking? What were they doing if they didn't think that the people amongst whom they were working had the capacity to be good Protestants? Curious.
Comments, and there was somebody else. Sorry, who else? Okay, you go. Well, we'll work out. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for a great paper. And one of the things that we're keen to explore in our group is those early tensions between different versions of, or different understandings of race and its more biological inflections or more ethnic inflections. And you've uncovered a lot of that for us, which is very useful. And so I was interested in your mention of language and the studies of language, and also the relationship with theology. So a couple of days ago, we had Professor van Heesteen give a talk about why we should be using neo-Darwinist ideas to understand the human person and personhood in relation to theology. He's a theologian. And so he's trying to marry theology and Darwinist biology. This is just a few days ago. And so, I'm sorry. I'm wondering if I mean, I'm deeply appreciating your attention to historical detail, and you're leaving a lot of the resonances across time to our contemporary world quite open, which is nice. I'm wondering if you can comment on the ways in which the politics of language at Stellenbosch University there's any light to be shed on them given your particular researches. And just to say, in the 70s, when I was born in Swaziland, we used to hang out at this hot springs. And those days it was called the Cuddle Puddle.
Okay, one more comment or question. Rob?
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating paper. One of the things that I guess I want to pick up on, and partly because I was outside during it, and the images, you know, were quite tantalising, made them more tantalising actually, but not being able to see them. And I was just thinking that your picture of them dressed up, he looks a bit less severe than I imagined he did from what you were saying about him. But the pictures of the khaki things, that's what it was. Yeah. And I was really interested about that. And when did they wear? How many people? Was it in this club that people wore them, or was it that lots of people wear them? When did they wear it? And I didn't realise the women that wore it as well. That's a mistake. So, can you say something about that?
Yeah.
And when did that come about?
Because this may be the last round, I'm still going to do one more person. Tali.
Thanks, Andrew.
Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kylie Thomas, and I teach in the English department. Thank you so much. I thought that was really fascinating and also very disturbing, and I'm wondering exactly what we should do with this. And of course, you know, I mean, this has sort of been a question that prompted this project. But the more that's uncovered about it, the more disturbing it gets. And I've just been teaching my first seminars to second and third year students to all white classes, and I'm just so disturbed by that. So I mean, and it's great having this talk, and it's made me think a lot. So thank you. I've got a question about the quote you began with, done by Moody. And it's just a question of like, where is that from? Where he's claiming he's not a racist, and in what context was that?
Okay, yes, thank you very much. I'll address them first. Thank you to Kies for that very generous, a much better version of what my paper is about than I did. So at least you know what it is about. But you can read it. I have got a last section. As I said, it's quite long. Bear that in mind. I like the long essay. This is the format I like to write in 20,000 words. So now 10,000 words, you can't say much. And so that's what I go for. So bear in mind it's a little bit long. I do like detail, as you'll find out. And I need to round off the section on masculinities, but I think you can just circulate the paper as it is for those that are interested, and then get an updated version maybe in 2 weeks once I've written that section. Okay, I'll go backwards. What do you do with this? Yes, well, I am struck by, I mean, it might seem a bit presumptuous to walk in from UWC and denounce the atmosphere, the kind of a white student population at Stellenbosch, but I am struck by the limitations of transformation, let's say. I do teach in a context where, you know, even spotting a white student in your first year lectures is something rather unusual. You get quite excited about it and you try and work out which European or American university they are. So, I mean, there is an extent to which I think UWC could transform in a kind of different direction as well. But I think in general, you know, my sense is, take the University of Stellenbosch's sense of its history. I've been looking through, you can sometimes get free copies from the archive of the university history. I mean, it really is. It was written appropriately when Verwoerd was still alive, and the pictures of him shaking the hands of all the white students and walking around, and all the chapters are written by men. And the picture is, you know, even to find out how many women students there were. There was a woman lecturer, I think Lydia van der Kamp, who lectured, I think it was in Afrikaans and Nederlands in the late 1920s, but relatively late. So it's basically a completely male-dominated, completely white, completely self-reflexive story. It's an anniversary collection. But if you want to find out anything about the university, I did find out a few facts, like the fact that they had 103 students in Bantu Tala and Volkekunde, or actually possibly even just in Volkekunde. In the second year Eiselen was here, they had 41 in the first year. You must remember, you know, Kirsten's point about influence, I think, is very important. That Volkekunders were enormously influential. Whether we can track that influence as directly on central policy making through theology and other things, but the numbers of people who are being attracted, this is very significant. You know, people like Audrey Richards and Winifred Hernley trained internationally recognized scholars, but she struggled to get more than 20 people in her first year class. Here you had classes of 64 and 50. On average there were about 50 or more students, more than double, and the output of ideologically driven theses, because the theses of these were very strongly informed by racial ideology, ideas about classification, ideas about, especially about African religion. I think they followed Eiselen's research agenda. Eiselen's research agenda was the exploration of African religion, in which included rain-making, dice throwing, and other things. And a lot of the students looked at that kind of thing. In the case of Skuman, it was the king ideas, royal ideas about kingship, and a religious complex of beliefs associated with kingship. But they really followed his lead in somewhat exoticized tradition. Yeah, so what do we do with this? What do we do today? Well, I think re-examining the history of the university would be very important. I think you do have resources like this archive, which is quite remarkable, a wonderful librarian, and even figures, you know, to find out how many male and female students there were. Largely women there were about 90% men in the mid-1920s. In the interwar years, Wits, I don't quite believe Bruce Murray claims that Wits had more women in arts than men. I think it's probably more like a significant minority of women, but there were many Jewish students. About a third of the students on Wits campus were Jewish in the 1930s. UCT had many women. It feminized very heavily. This didn't happen at Stellenbosch. Much, much slower. In the mid-1930s, there's still about, these are my own calculations based on jaarboeken, but there's still about close to 80% of men, 75 or 80% male student body. That's very, very different. There's a very different sense of the group you're interacting with. What's the ethos of the university? They were very male-dominated universities in terms of teaching staff. UCT, no, as I suggested with my Monica Wilson figures, which also have never been quoted before. UCT also doesn't want to tell parts of its own story, how male-dominated and really stiflingly conservative it was. But I think there are materials that you can look at in terms of, I don't know about the papers of Volkekunde academics. They're disappointing in a certain way. They're not as many as there are of these social anthropologists seem to have preserved their papers. I don't know why that is. In the case of P.J. Kurtzer, the most important, and Kirsten's former lecturer, his son did write a paper based largely on interviews and materials from him, which is where we get these figures about how many people actually did Volkekunde. I think it was very influential, and also Bantu Tala, which they closely associated with the idea of missionizing. Kurtzer and Eiselen went to teach at the Wellington Sendon School in the late 20s and early 30s. They had they were small classes, but I think the numbers were maybe 10 or 20. So I think they got their ideas out there. Yeah, so what do we do with this today? Well, I think some kind of scrutiny about the university's history in ways that go beyond for wood shaking hands with the white students would be a good idea, and exactly how that's done. Yeah, I guess the students at the university should look at. Institutional history is always difficult. Nobody wants to write a history. There's always a major politics around it. The guy who writes about UCT, Howard Phillips, got very little thanks for a very good history. He wrote about UCT up to 1948. It still hasn't been written after 1948. But increasingly these days, universities are businesses. So, you know, there's a big drive from the directorate. Come write the university. But most self-respecting historians don't really want anything to do with it because it seems very narrow and boring and institutional and dry. But I think in the case of Stellenbosch, it's a fascinating history. I mean, there are, you know, rows of apartheid prime ministers. D.F. Milan was the chancellor of this university from 1941 to 1957. H.P. Tom was a major broederbonder and had a huge influence on the writing of history in South Africa, was the director of the university after that. Smuts, after all, trained here. Herzog trained here in the late 19th century. It's got a tradition very closely associated, obviously, with Afrikaner nationalism and how you tell that. But I think my sense of reading these theses is there is a degree of complexity. I think the point about stereotyping people and distancing, looking retrospectively at Eiselen and seeing him as some kind of, you know, just as a simple, crude racist who you find distasteful. You know, I hope my paper is more complex than that. You'll have to read and see. But I think you have to show some kind of interest in the historical personalities and in specificity. And I think if you look at these students, there is actually quite an intriguing range of diversity in relation to their attitude to African cultures, the distance. They didn't all just follow, as I've suggested with Skuman, but he had two MA students who took very different lines. One was, you know, the Hera and the Almachtige, and very, very denunciatory towards African cultures and dismissive. And another student who wrote a thesis on the Barutsi Kaptein, who did Tswana fieldwork, who was very much more empathetic and engaged. It was a shorter thesis, but, you know, I think there is very clearly a difference, and people did bring something apart from Eiselen's ideological programming to what they did subsequently. Khaki dress, I mean, I need people to tell me about that. I don't really know exactly about it. I think it is striking. My sense is that clearly it's Eiselen who initiated this. There's a very different sense about that. And it becomes, I'd like to see the later pictures into the 50s, but I have a sense that it almost becomes the uniform that men and women wear. I assume that it's just for, I don't know, you know, I know too little about it. What did it mean in terms of your tours? If you went on tour, did you wear your uniform? Surely you didn't just wear it for the photograph, so it's some kind of sense of identity.
1938
yeah. Okay, it might have been, although this dates from 35, so it would have to, anyway. I think it does seem to be associated in general with the Voortrekker symbol, and Eiselen certainly was a fan of the Voortrekker. Theology and resonances across time, and the politics of language. Well, I don't know about the resonance across time. I'm a bit of a traditionalist and like to just say my piece and not too much else. So, you know, what his students were doing, well, I think other people are going to have to look at that. I have a sense in what he was doing here, and I have a sense from, you know, lots of people have written about P.J. Kutzer from a very strongly Afrikaner nationalist perspective. I think there's a fascinating thesis to be written on him because he was very prolific. Yeah, he became, people were very scared of him. I don't know if that's the sense you had in your class, but Hammond talks about how they're basically shit scared of this guy. In the 50s and 60s, he had this very, very rigid authoritarian presence. And you can see this young guy already in 1934, he wrote an essay on culture. He was much more strongly Afrikaner nationalist than Eiselen, who had a somewhat German, somewhat cosmopolitan inflection. It was basically culture is associated exclusively with the Duitse die France in the Afrikaner. There was no idea. In the paper, I explore the idea of a division between cultuurmense and natuurmense. That came from the German tradition, that there were nature peoples and culture peoples. The British tradition didn't have this. It was distinctive to German anthropological thought. And the cultuurmense, and I think that this definitely was an infusion into Afrikaner nationalism. And the idea that culture was extended to Africans, yes, you did. It was a form of study of beliefs and things like that. But whether you would call it their culture really means civilization. It's associated with music. And there's a piece that Kutzer writes, which really, in 1934 already, when he was hadn't done his PhD, which is very squarely about an ideology of white culture, a white civilization which is exclusive and relates to, but very much about the chios, a sense of spirit and togetherness and a texture that is not about anything you can measure, but about, it's a mentality, if you like, an affinity for music, an affinity for religion and things like that. From Bantu cultures are clearly completely excluded. There's no mention there of the Pedi or the Swazi who you don't feel welcome. This is in the Tijdschrift what is it? Tijdschrift for Letter and Kunst, I think. Is it Wetenschap? Thank you, Wetenschap and Kunst. Very important was where they published. Isabel Hofmeyr wrote a very important essay many years ago, well, I think it was 1984, called Creating a Nation from Words. And what she argued was that Afrikaans was created from words from after the period of the South African War until about 1930. And Eiselen and his students fit directly into that. That you had to craft a new press. There was an earlier language movement, but there was the creation of the nationale pers, new journals like the Huisgenoot, the Tijdschrift van Wetenschap en Kunst. And this was where they published. They published, there was the Brandwag as well. It was initially called the Brandwag, later the Nieuwe Brandwag. It was directly for an Afrikaner audience. And one thing I point out in my paper is that Eiselen cast his ideas in different ways for different audiences. He wrote a book, his only major book was called Die Stamskole van Zuid-Afrika, on initiation schools. And in his English language summary, there was no mention of race, there's no mention of biology, but the Afrikaans language text is filled with mentions of die Bergtamara as a dwergvolkie, soos die Pygmies and the Boesmans, etc., etc. So very clearly he was already skilled at marketing himself politically and addressing himself to different audiences. What did they think? I'm going to leave Susie's question to last because I'm not sure that I know the answer. You know, what did they think they're doing when they were missionaries if they didn't believe people had sufficient spiritual sensibility? I think they believed that they would become inferior Protestants. That's my sense. I think they believed that they could become Christian, they could become religious people, but they would take centuries to become civilized Christian people, Protestants who had the capacities and attainments of German people from a German tradition. So, you know, that's what I'd say. I think they still saw a value in the light and the values of some kind of small degree of common humanity. But I think there was a sense in which there were still two tiers of Christians. That would be my guess, but I think I'd have to look much more at their writings at the time. And why has nobody done this before? You know, I think that's the most interesting question in a way. There's all this material on a guy. For example, there's a speech he gives at Stellenbosch where he talks about racial. He did intelligence tests himself. He took a whole lot of Pedi schoolboys and he tested them. He then took Stellenbosch school pupils and tested them. Now 5 or 6 other scholars have read exactly this thing, and nobody, apart from myself, have reported on the fact that he did this. They all say he's not interested in intelligence testing, but in fact he's actually done tests on over 100 people. So how can you ignore that evidence? My reading is that it's about historiography. I guess I'm quite sympathetic to the liberal school, you might say. I think that after liberal, given the work I've done on, I think quite remarkable liberal women anthropologists, but others like Max Blackman who were trained in this tradition. I think there's an extent to which the retrospective view of class and revisionist scholarship, and then subsequently a kind of amorphous discourse scholarship, has tended to lead to the view that everybody was kind of thinking the same thing. You know, the liberal anthropologists were also, some of them were also segregationists, you know, they were also very ambiguous, like Eileen Krichler, she was pretty conservative. They've kind of forgotten the sense that there was a radical divide in South African society around the issue of race, and they've tended to suggest that everybody, you know, was rather limited in this morally superior way of the present. They all didn't really understand it was all about class or something like that. Which is what I was referring to as an adequate reading. So I think in retrospectives of anthropology, for example, there's a sense in which, well, liberals were also rather complicit and ambiguous. And yes, Eiselen might have been a little bit more ambiguous and had a few ideas about race, but largely these liberals were functionalists. They were static, timeless descriptions of the present. And when in fact there were radically different methodologies, ideological assumptions. So I think there's been a rather morally superior retrospective tendency to tie everyone. They're not radical enough really for us in South Africa of the 1970s and 1980s. Then I think what happened subsequently in the 1990s is that people liked it. And if you look at Paul Rich on liberalism, that's a classic example of that. Somebody like Ellen Hellman is read as a segregationist, complete rubbish. You know, her whole program was firmly anti-segregationist throughout her writings and as a member of the race relations. So he reads her as a kind of ambiguous liberal who somehow was also complicit in apartheid. And then in the 1990s, you have discourse theorists who see this all as, you know, kind of the meta-discourse of them all is still about the native. And, you know, somebody like Adam Ashworth, who wrote a very good book about the native question, but really it's about what are the possibilities of knowledge, what are the fundamental underlying concepts of which make possible statements about the native. Doesn't really get you to the heart of what was fundamental about this, which was a deeply political driven enterprise. Understanding African culture and society was deeply political at that time, whether you presented it sympathetically or in a derogatory way. And this, it seems to me, is what was driving them when you look at their papers. This was what they were trying to do. Support segregation in the case of Eiselen. He was a Herzog Kampfwachter. He wanted to support Herzog's ideas. He suggested that Africans were less intelligent. There was racial evidence to support that. Or they were culturally different in later years. He wanted to put them in separate areas. This was a deeply political project in its motivations. The significance of the rural backgrounds, yes, I do think there's a paternalism. I need to find out more about it. I do think it's very significant. I think in my case, I was making an argument about urban, middle-class, Afrikaner nationalist identity. What this guy, Dupasani, argues is in around the 30s, there is this idea of the urban Afrikaner, much stronger, more positive, more strident Afrikaner nationalism that relates from the confidence of an urban position. And many of these people, like Eiselen, who were cultuurdraers or cultuurleiers, who were ministers of religion, academics and others, had these backgrounds which had initially been rural and relatively remote and marginal. He came from an area where he couldn't go to school, kind of institutionalized school until he was 14. He went to King Edward's, then it was an English school where he was uncomfortable. And so they found a home in these urban spaces where the networks were denser, where there were institutions of churches and universities and things like that. The FRK that formed a kind of, I guess, a certain cohesion and a brotherhood that allowed for this very strongly masculine identity to develop. And, you know, in a sense that, that aspect I think is important. I don't know if you want me to take any more questions or anything that I have answered.
Yeah. No, I think, unless, I think you've pretty much covered it. We're sort of arriving at the point of closure, but if there's something final.
Yeah, there are a few things. You know, I would say, you know, I did look at Herman Gilumi's response, the issue of the responses to looking at the past. That Kier sent me, he'd written something on Volkekunde, and Gilumi responded and said, I suppose my response in general to the racial science and then the church is that the distinction between them wasn't necessarily that clear. All these people are cultural racists in a very fundamental sense, sometimes in you know, through an experience of measuring skulls and looking at cultural objects in museums, but they're also deeply religious. You know, the Geersvader they go and teach at the Wellington Sentence Institute. So I think in many ways a very false divide. You know, many of these intellectuals, I think what this issue raises for me is what is scientific racism? I'm increasingly dissatisfied with the idea that it's just biology. This man is clearly a scientific racist, but yet he gave up on ideas about biology and coded them in terms of ideas about culture, Protestantism, and things which were informed by race but weren't expressed in terms of the measurement of the skull. They were informed in terms of linguistic spirit or something like that, the spirit of a language, the spirit of folklore, the spirit of a tradition, or something different. So it really raises the question. There's a whole literature on what calls itself racial science, you know, Saul DeVoe's illicit union, scientific racism. What is scientific racism? Is scientific racism only racism that relates to a laboratory measurement to show biological difference? Is it only an intelligence test? Well, I think the case of Eiselen really muddies that, because yes, he did take intelligence tests, but he strategically chose to code his ideas about race in a different kind of language. Sometimes ideas of coarse Negroid race surface in his writings in the early 30s, but more often he's saying, let's enhance the development of Africans, let them experience, develop their own culture, let them learn their own traditions and folklore. All that is informed by deeply fundamental, and I would say also scientific sense of difference. and he's choosing to describe it in terms of cultural difference and cultural divisions. So I do think increasingly, you need to think of what is scientific racism, and that's why science, like fieldwork, is historically specific. How are people using that idea of science? And one thing I try to show in my paper is that his idea of science was the idea that was drawn from these linguists. It was about little bites of information. He later applied that to culture. You could take the vowel and the verb, and if you read his PhD thesis, well, it's virtually unreadable in German, with it's about the I consonant but underlying it is an entire theory about Hamitic peoples, lighter skinned peoples migrating from the north, about the Urbantu, an original language, but it's couched in terms that are, if you didn't read those first few pages where he says, I'm following Meinhof's theory about Urbantu and Hamitic peoples, and then goes on to the this consonant, that consonant, that consonant, that language, it's like a little grid of information, or tiny bites of information. But I think that very notion of science is something one obviously needs to historicize, and that's really what I try to do in the paper, to suggest he borrows this directly from this guy he lives with, who's a great friend of the Berlin Missionary Society, who's an enormously respected African linguist in his day. He published about 10 or 15 books. He was seen as Hamburg was then the Mecca of the African linguist. And so even the question of disciplines, to say this is a paper about the history of anthropology, it's really as much a paper about the history of linguistics in South Africa. It's about Bantu studies. So I think the idea that we just can study anthropology discretely, I think the paper shows that Lestrade, I think they were very closely linked in this Volkekunde tradition, language and culture. They were Lestrade and Radcliffe Brown or Shapper, I don't think had much to do with each other at GCT. And certainly Doak was denounced as a complete idiot by Audrey Richards at Wits. So I think in this tradition, they were very close. So I think it relates to how you think about disciplines and what did they think they were doing? What was scientific? What was objective knowledge?
Great, thanks very much. We have a centenary in 2018. These new histories, Andre Walters is in the room somewhere. She's doing a PhD and she will